Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello, and welcome to our latest season of Cyberzone, Season 3, Episode 1. We're recording on the 18th of June 2025 during Privacy Awareness Week. My name is Eden Winokur, and I'm the Head of Cyber at Hall & Wilcox. I'm delighted today to be joined by Joe Smith, who's the Assistant Secretary at the National Office of Cyber Security. Joe has led the government's charge in a number of the most high-profile cyber matters that have impacted the Australian market. The topic for today's podcast is data breaches impacting personal information, the role of the National Office of Cyber Security. Joe, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Eden, it's a pleasure to be meeting with you outside of an incident.
Absolutely. So, Joe, I thought just to help people listening in who may not be familiar with you and the work that's done by the National Office of Cyber Security, and you might hear me refer to them as the NOCs. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be working at the NOCs?
Yeah, thanks, Eden. So cyber is one of those issues that I've constantly come back to in my career. It's one of those ones that hasn't necessarily been through a proactive choice. It's just one of those ones that's just kept coming back throughout my career. So I've been with the National Office of Cyber Security since it was established in May 2023. Prior to that, I worked at what's called the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre on cybersecurity regulation. So your clients and listeners will probably be familiar with the mandatory cyber incident reporting obligations. I led the development and implementation of those. Some of your key critical infrastructure clients might also be aware of the designation of a smaller subset of critical infrastructure assets known as systems of national significance. So I worked on that program as well. But prior to getting into cybersecurity, a lot of my work was in cyber crime, and I held a range of strategic and operational law enforcement roles across Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
So you can hear just from that brief background that Joe would definitely be a good person to get stuck in an elevator with, because I'm sure you've got quite a few good stories to tell. So just for the listeners, talking about mandatory reporting, talking about systems of national significance, so key legislation there, Privacy Act, Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, and then obviously there's a number of other reporting obligations, depending on the company who might be impacted by an incident. Joe, tell us a bit more about the NOCs and how it came to be set up and what are the goals?
Yeah, so the National Office of Cybersecurity and the role of the National Cybersecurity Coordinator, so that's Lieutenant General Michelle McGuinness, was established following reviews into the Optus and Medibank incidents back in 2022. The reviews found that there needed to be a centralised part of government that was responsible for planning, preparedness, and response to cybersecurity incidents. So the National Office of Cybersecurity was established then. A couple of key points for your listeners. So we're within the Department of Home Affairs, but we're separate to the regulatory function. And then also some changes through the limited use obligations as part of the Cybersecurity Act, further limit the use of information and how it can be used and shared by regulators. So very much setting up a function to coordinate and respond to incidents and making sure that it's separate to that regulatory function. The mission of the National Office of Cybersecurity is to enable and support trusted and efficient partnerships with the aim of improving national cyber preparedness and coordinating major cyber incident response. So we've got a range of responsibilities for planning, preparedness, and response activities for cyber incidents. My really amazing small dedicated team delivers a wide range of things. So there's national plans. So we're recording today and we've just released the Australian Cyber Response Plan that talks about how the National Office of Cybersecurity coordinates the national response to incidents. We've previously released some playbooks, which will talk about how the National Office of Cybersecurity supports impacted organisations within a range of sectors. We deliver exercise programs with government and industry stakeholders, and we're really pleased that we ran an exercise recently with a range of law firms that are involved in cyber incident response. We also evaluate the response to the national responses that we run. So your readers might be able to have a look at the response into the HWL Ebsworth breach, which is on our website as well. But from a cyber incident perspective, I think the primary goal is for us to minimize the burden on impacted entities by providing a single point of contact between them and government and industry stakeholders, and working really closely with incident response firms, crisis management firms, and law firms like yours, Eden, to support your clients to navigate the range of stakeholders to help them to respond to an incident.
Yeah, that's a terrific overview, and we're going to come back to what happens when an incident happens, and a client has figured out that there's a lot of impacted data. It could be driver licenses from multiple states. It could be passwords. I want to come back to that, but I wanted to, before doing that, just pick up on a couple of things mentioned in that answer. So the first one was limited use. So you've mentioned limited use. That's obviously quite a new thing, and not everyone listening will be familiar with that. Do you want to just talk a little bit about what is limited use? Why was it brought in? How is the NOx hoping it will assist you do your job as well as you can?
Yeah, thanks, Eden. So limited use is contained in Part 4 of the Cybersecurity Act. And the purpose of limited use is to encourage the voluntary provision of information to the National Cybersecurity Coordinator during and before and during incidents. The purpose of it is to encourage the provision of information, and it does that by putting limited use provisions on certain purposes under the Act for how the information can be used to respond to the incident. And also it puts on those limited use provisions for how regulators who might receive the information can use it. The key thing being that it can't be used for investigations, compliance, and enforcement activity. So the key point about that is to encourage the open flow of information when an organization is still working through the incident. Things might not necessarily be clear. So it's about providing that comfort that the information that they provide during the heat of an incident can only be used for supporting the response to the incident, and it can't be used for those enforcement, compliance, and investigation purposes.
Thanks for sort of setting that out, Joe. And I know it's a key issue that clients certainly ask us about. What are the risks in disclosing the information? What are the benefits of engaging the NOx? And so it's something that we're regularly discussing. And the introduction of limited use, I think, will help those conversations and in turn help the NOx get information that you're seeking to in turn achieve the goals that have been set. I guess when those listening, or for those who are not familiar with the NOx, and sort of hearing a bit about the role and what it's set up for, they might, clients might think, well, this sounds quite public sector focused, or, obviously where if you follow the news, there's a lot of news about cyber warfare or the use of cyber targeting nation states. And of course, that would be of the utmost importance to really everyone, or should be to everyone in the country. But I just wanted to make it really clear that NOx helps private sector companies. And so do you want to just talk a bit about sort of what's the typical client or private sector organization that might find themselves talking to? Can it be anyone? Is it any particular sector? Do you want to just give a bit of a flavour for the types of organizations you might be dealing with?
Yeah, thanks, Eden. So the National Office of Cybersecurity, obviously we focus on what we term nationally significant incidents. So those are the incidents that are going to have an impact on critical infrastructure, large parts of the economy, large parts of the population. But it also might be those incidents that require a nationally coordinated response. So it might be a business that's operating in multiple states and territories. It might be a business that has work across multiple sectors. But it's not just the big end of town. One of the things I'll probably highlight is that we also support incidents where we've found there's critical small to medium enterprises that provide a service which has lots of touch points and really requires that sort of coordinated response. In terms of the types of matters that we've been involved in, so we've supported a range of entities across multiple sectors of the economy. That's included financial sector, the health sector, professional services sector, transport, education, and many others. Obviously, we can't help every organisation that is subject to a cybersecurity incident, but in those situations, we try and make sure that we put them in touch with the relevant parts of government that can support them.
Yeah, brilliant. I wanted to come back then to, and I flagged this before, sort of talking a bit about personal information. Of course, it is Privacy Awareness Week. Hall & Wilcox are a supporter of the initiative, as are sort of many fellow law firms and other, many very good organisations, and it's an important week, and there's a good tradition that's been building. I know with the work that I do, one of the most challenging parts is when we sort of figure out that a lot of data on personal information has been stolen, or it could become published on the dark web, which can then be used by criminals to try and commit awful types of things like identity fraud or credit fraud. It's sort of very distressing to see some of the consequences that come from these matters. And I guess I was, keeping in mind sort of privacy and, the misuse of tax file numbers, driver licenses, passports. How does the NOx coordinate? Because I imagine that, if you're an organisation providing services across Australia and you, for whatever reason, need to collect, say, ID documents, you might have your employees' tax file numbers. When you get a call and it's a company that has these multi-jurisdictional issues that can result in things like identity fraud, how does the NOx help in that situation?
Yeah, I think the main thing to highlight is our primary role is to help minimize the burden on the impacted organization. That really enables the internal incident response and crisis management team to focus on the internal response. And we work really closely with the impacted organization and their third-party providers to support them with the external response and engagement. So at a fundamental level, what we do is we coordinate the Australian government's response, and then we plug in states and territories through various arrangements. The key thing there is that what we're trying to achieve is that ensuring that the response activities are progressed and deconflicted. So we primarily support the directly impacted entity of the victim of the cybersecurity incident, and by bringing together a range of stakeholders that can support them to manage the consequences of the incident. There's a few ways that we can do that. So if it's a matter where it's a relatively straightforward with only a few sort of stakeholders that they need to engage with, we can coordinate briefings and information sharing. So, even we've worked on a range of matters where, we've facilitated engagement with Services Australia if it related to Medicare information, the Australian Taxation Office if it related to tax information, the Australian Passports Office if it related to passports, Department of Home Affairs if it related to visas. But when it becomes more sort of complex and a wider sort of response is required, what we tend to do is we tend to establish working groups that can break out and deal with particular matters. So, for example, if there was a really complex data breach and an organisation needed support in better understanding how to do e-discovery, we could bring together parts of government to support through an e-discovery sort of data analysis working group. If there were issues relating to driver's licenses across multiple jurisdictions, we could bring all of the driver's license issuing bodies together to provide the impacted entity with that single source of truth. One of the things that we found is that there'll be information that's available to organizations, but we really want to make sure that they hear it from the relevant parts of government directly to make sure that the organization gets the latest information about, does a driver's license need to be reissued? Does a passport need to be reissued? And how can the impacted individual engage with those services to do that? I think probably one more thing just to highlight is that we support the impacted entity by providing consolidated whole of government communications. So your clients and listeners might have seen during the MediSecure cybersecurity incident, that was the first time that we used a public web page that spoke through all of the issues that related to the information that had been exposed, much in the same way that you'd work with your clients to support them to provide that information directly to impacted customers as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really great overview. And just for those listening who haven't dealt with a major cyber incident, and hopefully that's a lot of you, and I hope you never have to go through it. And those who have been through it will probably be able to relate to this. But very early on, and really in the first few weeks of responding to a major cyber incident, a lot of stakeholders have a lot of questions. And sometimes it can be challenging because, a lot of resources are taken up trying to respond to the questions, and they're important questions to respond to. At the same time, you're also trying to investigate what's happened, make sure the client's meeting its regulatory obligations. But there's a lot of noise and everything's happening really quickly. If we just use, say, driver licenses as an example, if you've got a scenario where a company is holding driver licenses for all 8 state and territories, hypothetically, and rather than having to speak to each state individually and provide the same answers over and over and get the similar or substantially similar questions, and the work of having to deal with that 8 times compared with contacting Joe in the Knox, maybe Joe can organise one set of questions, or maybe it's a quick phone call where everyone comes together. Rather than doing this 8 times, half an hour, 8 times 4 hours, do it once for half an hour, answer all of the questions. You've just saved 3.5 hours that you don't need to spend because of this coordination role. So I just wanted to give people an example there of sort of just a basic one, but it's that kind of efficiency that certainly in our time working with the Knox we've observed, and extrapolate that through the course of a matter can save substantial time and resources to really help minimize the impact of an incident. So I just wanted to use that example. Joe, final question for you. What's your advice to organizations who are impacted by a cyber breach or a data breach?
So the first thing that I'll say is for organisations that are impacted to report to the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cyber Security Centre that you've had a cyber security incident. The Australian Signals Directorate's Australian Cyber Security Centre is the technical authority on cyber security. They will use the information to understand whether or not other sort of organisations within your sector or across sector has been impacted, whether or not there needs to be the provision of advice to the whole of the economy through cyber.gov.au. So really stressing that ASD can provide advice and assistance to those impacted organisations. Obviously, data breaches, those types of things, reporting to relevant regulators, including the OAIC, and also those that are relevant to your sector. And then reporting to the Australian Federal Police or State and Territory Police that you've been a victim of a cybercrime. Just remembering that there are those various reporting sort of elements that should be done. But more holistically, there's probably a few things that I'd highlight. So organizations need to understand early if it's a technical incident or if it's a cyber incident, because when you're going into a cyber incident, that's when a range of stakeholders will want to find out if there is any issue with connecting to your organization, if there's any issues that might be across the sector, or organizations that might use similar software or services might want to find out if there's a problem with that. I think one of the key things, and you alluded to it before, is that e-discovery and data analysis will take longer than organizations think. So organizations, through the experience that we've had with incidents, thought that certain types of information were stored on certain servers, and that certain types of information were not stored on those. Through a lot of painful experience, some organizations have worked out that they've had more information or more sensitive information than they thought stored on those. So it's about, mapping and understanding your networks and what data they might store, those types of things. The other thing that I'd probably highlight is that a range of external stakeholders are going to want to know about your incident and the response. That includes a range of stakeholders that you might not necessarily have thought about. So, states and territories will want to know if their citizens are impacted, if there's personally identifiable information, those credential issuing bodies, other departments and agencies that are relevant to the sector are going to want to know what types of things are impacted, but they're also going to know what types of things aren't impacted so that they can assure themselves that there's no further action for them to support the organisation to respond to the incident.
Yeah, that they're all really great points. Just picking up on one of them, which is data mapping. So, just for those listening who might not be familiar with the phrase, and Joe's mentioned e-discovery a couple of times as well. Data mapping is really just literally mapping out all the data that you hold and where it sits. It's absolutely one of our strong recommendations. Timely advice as well, given it's Privacy Awareness Week. It's one of the key things that we think organizations should be focused on. And e-discovery is something that really came in during large litigation and many years ago, where we're talking about something like a data breach. You might know a particular server has been compromised, but you might not really know exactly what's on that server because you say haven't done data mapping before the incident occurs. E-discovery is a technological process of taking all the data from a server, ingesting it into a system, and then using technology to scan across all of the data to see what kinds of personal information are held. So, the technology can identify things like driver's licenses, passports, Medicare numbers. It's looking for patterns, and it can be very helpful to enhance efficiencies when you've got to review, massive amounts of data. But it is very time consuming, and as Joe said, and I completely agree, it's probably something that's a bit underestimated, just how long it takes, and it can be challenging when you've got customers wanting to know, am I impacted, and you're not able to give them an answer. So that's a big tension and challenge that we face. And the other thing I'd mention is, I think, sort of again touching on one of Joe's points, one of the best ways to prepare for an incident is to run a tabletop exercise. And I know Joe's team does that throughout the country. We do it with clients as well. Really test the leadership team, test the decision makers on what would happen if an actual incident occurs, find those blind spots, understand the kinds of decisions you might have to make. And it's way better to do that in a relaxed tabletop environment than compared with when you're actually responding to an incident.
Yeah, I just think I'd build on that also by saying that it's really important to build those personal relationships during a calm sort of environment. So, if you're working with your third-party service provider, be they a cybersecurity firm, a law firm, or a communications firm, so that you're building those relationships with those people who are going to support you or you might need to work with during an incident, but building those relationships during a time of relative calm.
I strongly agree with that. Joe, thanks for joining Cyberzone, and thanks to everyone for listening today. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about ransomware and reporting obligations. So I hope you'll join for that discussion. As always, please get in touch if you've got any questions. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Joe, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Eden, thanks a lot.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.